They made me sit outside on a plastic chair at my sister's wedding. I remember the smell of the parking lot, cut grass mixed with cigarette smoke, and a faint trace of perfume from someone who had been hurriedly adjusting a veil. I remember the sun on my knees, and a cold, dark patch of red spreading across the front of my dress where a glass of wine had soaked through. And I remember thinking, with a clarity I didn't have as a child, that this was the moment everything I had been carrying for years would either crush me or finally let me go. My name is Emily Watson. Growing up, my parents always told stories about Victoria like she was the weather, predictable and essential. Her recital, her awards, the college acceptance letters. When I announced I wanted to study agricultural science, when I chose a career in sustainability, I learned very quickly that my interests were charming, but somehow never urgent. Victoria's accomplishments were the ones that showed up on mantelpieces and at family dinners. Mine were footnotes in conversations that drifted away. There were small, constant humiliations in the background of my life. At 14, I remember rehearsing a presentation about crop rotations and watching my mother's face fall into polite boredom. At graduation, Dad clapped a little later for me, then excused himself half an hour early to fetch Victoria from a meeting. When I got a job as a sustainability director at a mid-sized agricultural research center, they asked me to bring photos of my real family for a newsletter. My parents sent only Victoria's. For years, I learned to smile and let it follow me like a shadow. I didn't resent Victoria the way I thought other people expected. She was quiet and earnest in her own way. She believed the world owed her nothing and therefore kept her head down to prove herself. I resented what the family's pattern did to me, how it taught every room to expect less from me. It made me small by omission, and since I was raised to be kind, I covered my hurt with patience instead of answers. When I met Daniel, nothing about him invited spectacle. He was at a conference where I was presenting a paper on soil health. He asked thoughtful questions, then came to say hello afterward like he'd been sitting in the back row for a reason other than a polite obligation. He farmed, he said. He loved the work because it let him be practical. He loved the people who did the work. We started slowly. Coffee became dinners. Dinners became weekends on the farm. He introduced me to acreage the way someone might introduce a friend, without fanfare, as if it were ordinary to own great swaths of land. He let me help with planting schedules and ring sensors, and he loved listening when I spoke about crop rotations with the same light in his eyes I had once seen in my father. There was no city showmanship, no glossy car, no announcement. Just a tractor, a dog named Huck, and the quiet work of someone who built things with his hands. We married in a small ceremony on a Sunday, on a hill behind the farmhouse. Afterwards, life as Emily and Daniel settled into a rhythm I loved. What people in our small circles knew was one version of us, a farmer and his wife, quietly committed to sustainable practices. What they didn't know was the rest. Over the years, Daniel had inherited holdings and built Watson Agricultural Holdings into a multi-state operation. He managed, by our count, about 12,000 acres. He supplied produce and logistics to food distributors, invested in soil science startups, and quietly did land conservation work that meant more than accolades to him. Our household income reflected that scale. We could have shouted it from rooftops, but we chose discretion. Why hide it? Because I had learned the hard way that visibility in my family just meant another currency in which I would lose. Wealth, in our family narrative, didn't translate to respect for me. It would only give them more reasons to boast or to dismiss what I care about. If I told my mother we were comfortable, if I let the small victories be public, I feared they would turn them into more opportunities to explain how I still hadn't measured up to Victoria. So Daniel and I made a conscious choice: humility as strategy. We were proud of what we'd built together, but we kept it small in the face of a family that equated loudness with worth. That quiet made me safe, and for a while it made me content. At family events, I learned to accept diminishment as a familiar thing. Hugs that didn't last, compliments that arrived only for Victoria, a rolling of eyes when I spoke about career moves. I rehearsed lines: graciousness, gratitude, patience. Inside, it felt like a slow erosion. Daniel saw it, of course. He never told me to fight battles on his behalf. He listened, held me afterward, and trusted me to set my own limits. That trust hardened over time into something like steel. He respected my choices. When I said I didn't want an argument, he didn't push. When I said I would rather keep our life private, he didn't make me explain. So when Victoria finally announced her engagement, and later the wedding, I decided to play it as I always had. That wedding was going to be everything they fantasized, and I told myself I would be there for my sister in a way that felt honest, not as an offering to their approval, but as a boundary of my own choosing. I agreed to help where I could. I paid a deposit for the reception space because I thought a sister shouldn't have to worry about that, and because kindness felt like something I could give without giving myself away. The day of the wedding started bright and precise, with the kind of nervous energy that lives in hotel lobbies. The venue looked like a magazine spread. Guests arrived in suits and gowns. There were floral arches everywhere. Crystals glinted where the light hit them. I arrived with a knot inside me, a tiny, sensible knot, uncertain whether they'd make me feel small or whether my own resolve would hold. They made me sit outside. They told me there was a waiting area for people who needed to be nearby until an important guest arrived. It was a narrow service lane on the side of the venue, between a hedge and a delivery door, with plastic folding chairs lined up like a poor excuse for seating. I sat, and people walked past me in silk and sparkles, heading inside to applause and champagne. Victoria walked by in her dress, carrying a glass. Derek, he's always been quiet with a practiced grin, walked beside her. They didn't look at me. A bridesmaid came by and whispered, "You can stay here until the VIP arrives," as if it were a kindness. The insult landed like a stone. At some point, the laughter from inside was loud and bright. A woman bumped my chair. Derek nudged Victoria and said something I couldn't hear. Then a glass of red wine tipped. It landed on me. Hot, wet, dark bleeding across my skirt, down the front of my dress. For a second, I felt like I'd been pushed off a cliff. I went still, breath caught, waiting for someone to say sorry, to offer a napkin, to pull me inside and make the embarrassment go away. No one did. Victoria kept walking. Derek smiled at someone by the door. A few guests glanced at me, as if whatever happened outside the door was less interesting than the party unfolding within. I stood up. The wine had left a band, a dark crescent, and my hands trembled. I could have gone to the ladies' room and tried to salvage the dress, but the point wasn't the stain. The point was the language of it all, that I belonged in a peripheral space until the guests they valued decided otherwise. Daniel had stayed in the car. He had said he'd wait for me in the parking lot because he wanted to give me room. That, just then, felt like the only thing that made sense. He had seen the setup earlier, and the names on the seating charts. He could have marched in and caused a scene. He didn't. He came to me quietly, took my hand, and asked me if I wanted to leave. My throat closed. There was 1,000 things I wanted to say to Victoria in that moment. Angry, pleading, all the small accumulations of being dismissed. But there was one very honest thing I did. I cried. We walked to the car. People looked toward us as we left. A few heads turned, the way they might look at an odd piece of art. Interesting for a moment, then dismissed. I heard Victoria laugh inside the venue, the insulation of happiness muffling whatever apology might have formed. We drove to a nearby cafe. Daniel sat across from me with a paper cup, hands wrapped around it. He didn't ask for the gory details. He let me tell him. When I stopped, he reached across the table and put his hand on mine. He said calmly, "Are you okay?" I said, "No, but I will be." That should have been the end of it. the simple exchange between two people who loved each other. Instead, the wedding became the threshold where something larger moved. A few hours later, as the reception's playlist stuttered between songs and someone adjusted microphones, a man from the venue found a strategic way to step outside by the service door. He recognized Daniel. At least, that was the first story we were told. A venue manager paused as he saw the name tag on Daniel's jacket. He remembered a conversation about crop supply and a winter contract for produce. He mentioned, almost casually, that Watson Agricultural had been an important client. Daniel, who values clarity above drama, said in a voice low and steady that commanded the attention of a suddenly larger circle, "I'm a farmer. I own 12,000 acres. I run Watson Agricultural Holdings. And yes, we work with this venue." There was a pause that felt like a held breath inside a room. People who had been laughing moments before stopped and looked over their shoulders. Victoria's face changed from amusement to confusion. Derek's smile disappeared like someone had cut the thread that had been holding it up. The manager, now partway between flustered and apologetic, explained that they had allowed a spot for the VIP only because of a supposed donor. He walked inside, and soon there was a ripple of whispers. Someone asked, "Are they actually?" and then stopped. What happened next wasn't cinematic violence. It was a series of adjustments, the way a room rearranges itself when you realize what you assumed may not have been true. The wedding coordinator stepped out and confirmed in a now vocal tone that several of the financial arrangements were more complicated than they'd been told. The anonymous donation, footing part of the bill, had come from an account connected to the event, but the deposit we had made earlier showed up on a note in the office. Someone in hospitality recognized Watson's name, and recognition quickly became ownership. I could feel the temperature of the whole event tilt. The people who had been in positions of power, those whose opinion mattered most to Victoria, looked toward Daniel with a new light in their eyes, not the warm glow of intimacy, but the calculating shine of commerce. I remember thinking, with a clarity that felt like winter light, that the same family who had been so ready to push me into a corner now wanted to stand by me when it was convenient. There was more to come. In the next hour, Daniel stayed composed. He didn't gloat. He spoke facts. He didn't make a scene of vindication. Instead, he asked the venue coordinator a few direct questions about contracts and payments. A practical man in a practical moment. An exchange then unfurled I hadn't expected. A staffer from Derek's company walked up, face drawn, and asked to speak privately with Daniel. They stepped to the side. Voices were low, but it was clear from the way the staffer left with a paper envelope and a shaken gait that information had changed hands. I learned later what was said. Derek, who had listed himself for a promotion at his workplace, had expense reports in his name that HR had flagged. There were outstanding personal debts. There were questions about the origin of some reimbursements. HR had put a hold on the promotion pending an inquiry. These weren't public indictments, and I do not say them to humiliate him beyond what was already exposed, only to show the way assumptions can crumble when they meet facts in the open. Daniel didn't orchestrate any of this. He didn't set a trap. He simply refused to be silent about what was being misrepresented about our capacity, and he insisted on clarity. He asked straightforward questions that an owner of a business would ask. That act of refusing to let things remain unexamined had immediate consequences. Derek's promotion was paused. The donors who had been ready to sign on began to reconsider. People who had been counting on a certain social capital now faced the truth that appearances were not the same as backing. At one point, the coordinator came to me with a receipt and a worried look. There had been additional charges and a remaining balance. She assumed openly that I would cover it. "You helped with the deposit," she said. "It would be simpler if you just paid the rest." I looked at the crumpled invoice, a number that, in itself, wasn't the point. The point was the expectation behind it, that my kindness meant I'd also play the role they assigned me. Standing there, with wine-stained cloth folded at my feet, and my dress a ruined compass pointing toward the truth of what had just happened. I felt a shift inside me. I paid the deposit because I wanted to be kind, I told her. I am not paying the rest. It wasn't a dramatic shout. It was a refusal that landed like a hinge locking. The coordinator blinked. Around us, voices rose and fell. Victoria looked as if a curtain had been pulled back, and sunlight had found her backstage. What followed was messy and human. My parents tried to smooth it over. What could they say now? Their favorites had made choices that were suddenly more complicated than the family script allowed. Victoria, stunned, left the reception for a moment to call her mother. Derek watched with a kind of dawning disbelief. People whispered about class and the quiet power people carried when they never announced it. Some guests looked at me with new curiosity, as if my composure could be graded now that they knew the measure of my marriage. But the real, enduring change came in how I felt afterward. For the first time in a long while, I realized that the option to protect myself was not a betrayal of my family, nor a surrender to pride. It was a boundary. The years of quiet humiliations, the interruptions and the micro-invalidations had taught me that being diminished in front of others was not a sacrificial morality. It was a wear on the soul. Saying no to being financial backstop was not revenge. It was definition. This is how I will allow you to stand in my life. There were consequences beyond the reception. HR at Derek's company completed their inquiry and found expense report irregularities that led to disciplinary action. Derek's promotion was formally rescinded. I won't say that those outcomes made me happy. They were complicated and painful in ways I didn't anticipate. Watching someone you know fall from a narrative you've been written into doesn't kindle joy. But what I did see was a clearer picture of who people were when the glitter wore off. For my family, everything rearranged. Invitations stopped coming for a few months. There were phone calls, my mother's voice full of a softness that had rarely been there before, asking if I would talk. There were tearful messages from Victoria in the early days, apologizing in ways that felt both true and too little. She said she hadn't realized how some of her actions made me feel. I could believe parts of it, but I had also learned the value of pace. Repair is not an obligation. It is a mutual process. I decided quietly and without fanfare that I would not rush to rebuild some bridges just so others could feel comfortable. I accepted that I had been hurt and that, like any wound, it needed tending on my terms. I accepted lunches and conversations with my sister across months, not days, and I let other things go. There were some doors I wanted to open again. Others I closed for the foreseeable future. That felt frightening and, at the same time, soberly necessary. What I gained in the aftermath was not a trophy. There was no parade, no resounding chorus announcing my vindication. There were, instead, small realities. Colleagues who had always known my work now reached out with invitations to speak about sustainability. An editorial asked for an article about agricultural stewardship and the role of family farms in modern supply chains. People who had assumed one thing about me started asking questions, more curious than dismissive. Humbled, I accepted recognition in a tempered way. I let it sit next to the quiet knowledge that the most important validation was not external at all. It was the unshakable truth that I owed no one the diminishment of my dignity. Daniel and I kept our quiet. He didn't posture. He continued to run the company responsibly, make decisions at meetings about soil health and conservation, and pay attention to the people on the ground who did the physical labor. He never turned our private life into a weapon. His calmness, his refusal to perform vindication, taught me something about real strength. True authority, I realized, doesn't need an audience. It needs clarity of purpose and courage to act with integrity. Victoria's engagement eventually ended. The ending wasn't a scene of moral triumph. It was a sorrowful recognition that the relationship had been based, in part, on illusions that couldn't be maintained under scrutiny. She and I had long conversations afterward, slow, sometimes halting attempts to name what had been missed. She apologized in a way that meant she had to do the work herself, not so I could grant forgiveness lightly. I accepted that too. Forgiveness that is given to settle a table is not the same as the one that grows when both people change. Sometimes people ask me if I regret the decision not to pay the rest of the balance, or if my pride cost us peace. I tell them the same thing. I regret the pain that ensued for everyone, because pain is real and heavy and not a prize. But I do not regret claiming the dignity of a line drawn. There is a difference between humility and self-erasure. I had spent enough years being small to spare myself no more. I want to be clear about what happened and what I will not do. I will not relish the fallout from Derek's career. Discipline at work is a consequence of choices, not something to exult in. I will not pretend that my family's actions were simple or that their love was performative. Most of them tried, in their ways. But I also refuse to be the person who quietly sacrifices her self-worth so that others can maintain a flattering narrative. That is not kindness. That is capitulation. If there is one truth I wish I'd understood earlier, it is this. People will always speak about you in the vocabulary they understand. If that vocabulary is about appearances and social advantage, it will never expand to include the quiet work you do, unless you insist it does. Insisting doesn't mean creating drama. It means choosing where you stand. So what I did after all of that was practical. I continued my work in sustainability, accepting the invitations that aligned with my values and saying no to the rest. I supported the farm's expansion into conservation easements that protected vulnerable land. I rebuilt my relationship with my parents on terms that included honest boundaries. I refused to be the last resort for every family crisis that had been their pattern. And I learned to accept the possibility that some relationships will never fully be what we hope. Some doors are not closed forever. They are simply locked until the people on the other side grow. If you've ever been made small at family gatherings, if someone in your life has been given the power to name your worth when you know your value, hear me. You do not have to accept their narrative. Your life does not have to be a constant answer to their unasked questions. You can work quietly. You can be generous, but you can also be guarded. You can choose who gets to rely on you, not as a test of your love, but as a testament to your self-respect. I am not shouting this from a mountaintop. I am telling it as a person who chose to stop letting other people's projections dictate my boundaries. Daniel and I still live simply in many ways, and we still keep much of our life private. But when the world needed clarity, we offered it. Not for spectacle, not for revenge, for truth. If this story resonates with you, if you've ever felt overlooked or like the quiet parts of you were dismissed, subscribe and stay for more stories about setting boundaries and finding steady strength. There are voices here that say, you must shrink to fit someone else's spotlight. I'm proof that you can step out of the shadow without stepping into arrogance. The final thing I want to leave you with isn't a lesson about winning or losing. It's a small, stubborn truth. Build a life that is so clearly lived on your terms that the noise around you becomes background. Love the people who love you for who you are. Hold out a hand to those trying to change, but do not allow yourself to be proof of someone else's story. I walked away from that wedding with a dress I had to salvage, but I also walked away with a clearer map of myself. I didn't repair everything. I didn't play the part of victim or victor. I chose a path, slow, careful, and true. And every now and then, when my heart flashes back to that plastic chair and the warmth of the wine stain, I remember Daniel's quiet hand on mine in the cafe and know that sometimes the right thing is simply to refuse to be erased. If you found something in this story that helps you, please like and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Tell me in the comments if you've ever had to draw a line. I read them. I answer when I can. And if you want more stories about setting boundaries, family, and the strange freedom that comes from claiming your worth. There are other videos here that dive deeper into those moments. Watch one next.